Afternoon all. I've just witnessed a very exciting game between Magnus Carlsen and Hikaru Nakamura in round 12 of Tata still 2013. Let's have a look at it. Magnus playing white played e4. Before this game was being relayed on various sites, on chess games for example, it's easy to do a comparison check. On classical games the score is 5-0 before this game with 13 draws, so Magnus was going into the game a heavy favourite on classical time controls, but it's the more recent games where Nakamura was playing more solidly and was able to get draws. So let's see this game. He played actually the Sicilian defence, a very exciting, dynamic, aggressive defence, aiming for counter attack quite often. And after knight f3 we see knight c6, inviting usually what is known as the Kalashnikov Sicilian, which is one of my favourite Sicilian defences when I was a kid, and I even scored quite well sometimes in long FIDE rated games against sometimes 2300 plus opposition with this very sharp dynamic opening. So the idea after d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, black can play for a huge gaping hole on d5 here with the move e5, which, although a forcing move, it does mean this gaping hole can be usually exploited by some neat manoeuvring by white around it. In particular, knight b5, as Magnus plays here, is usually a prelude for example, knight f6, knight c3, the knight's coming back, and later bishop g5, knight d5, c3, and the knight dancing like this around d5. But we have a different breed of fish here slightly, because black does not play the move knight f6, but rather this d6, which I think is Kalashnikov territory. So what is the advantage to white of black not threatening that e4 pawn immediately? Well, one thing for sure is that knight c3 doesn't seem mandatory anymore. In this position there is also another way of not only strengthening this pawn but also strengthening the grip on d5, and this move looks quite logical from that perspective. The move is g3. Okay, now g3 might seem to come with some downsides, but okay, it's the downside which is picked up from Nakamura does require a certain amount of risk taking. This next move h5 is played, so the idea to undermine, using g3 as an underminable point here, and try and generate some counterplay and a dynamic attacking game. There are certain requirements though in chess that are met with, for example, castling and developing pieces. It provides opposition with a basic level of security in the wider sense, especially against, for example, forcing moves. And the reason time and again it's demonstrated by even very strong players, and even myself recently, not so strong, sometimes don't castle, is that sometimes there seems to be these great opportunities to do things which seem good at the time, but sometimes they are punished. And in chess the most brutal way to punish the kind of rule violations of chess, whether that be development or not castling early, not developing, the most brutal form of punishment in chess is involving forcing moves against the king. So will we see this here in this game? That will black be being open-minded, will be punished for not casting or routinely developing, or even playing the Sveshnikov rather than the Kalashnikov? Let's see. I'm not saying actually the Kalashnikov is an inferior version of the Sveshnikov, but this looks with h5 to be slightly risky already, this position. Magnus plays knight 1 to c3, so he's not routinely fianchetting the bishop here. He is depriving this knight of a retreat to c3, which might have been interesting for that one to go to d5 and this one to go to c3. And he's saying he doesn't mind this knight coming back, allowing b5 threatening the fork. So this actually happens now, a6, and we see what looks to be a Sveshnikov mechanism here in the standard Sveshnikov. Now knight d5, because black is now threatening b4, so knight d5 entirely logical, and this one would normally reroute like this to celebrate that d5 gaping hole. Now often you might think, well, why would the Sveshnikov offer this huge structural weakness in the form of the d5 square? Often it is the case that white, in trying to celebrate that weakness, gives up, say, the dark square bishop by playing moves like bishop g5 and taking on f6, doubling black's pawns. But black sometimes has dynamic counterplay with f5 and bishop e6, and sometimes this dark square bishop in particular is very useful later. Will this be the case in this game? Will actually white even relinquish the bishop pair at some point? Well, the thing is, I think Nakamura has factored this in, and he doesn't want to give up even the option of white giving up the dark square bishop here, because his next move is a little bit sneaky, knight ge7. So he's avoiding this pin, bishop g5, which would give white the option of exchanging dark square bishop for knight and strengthening this grip on d5. Okay, but this does come with some downsides. It seems, for example, the bishop is now hemmed in here, and if g6 is played after this, then that would be embarrassing for knight f6 being mate. So it's not entirely clear how black proceeds to develop pieces from here and castle safely. This next move by Magnus, bishop g2, is also benefiting from the fact that knight takes d5 might actually be answerable with e takes, not only extending the scope of the bishop, but giving white a useful e4 square. So it's not without downsides to actually seal up that d5 square with a pawn here instead of a piece. Furthermore, it's not even necessary actually in this particular position for c3, because b4 might be answerable with knight c4, with an added bonus that d6 is a bit vulnerable as well in this particular position. So it's not clear if c3 is actually even needed. Like, it's a sort of thematic move in Sicilian Sveshnikov. Black plays in this position now bishop g4, and it does provoke, in theory, what would be a weakness on the diagonal, this move f3. But with this bishop on f8 and this huge knight on d5, this diagonal is not a major concern for white. White simply wants to avoid being kicked around. Having the queen on d1 is kind of ideal. It's on the center point d5, doesn't want to move it necessarily away from d5. So the bishop goes to e6. And now maybe Magnus doesn't really want to wait necessarily for b4, which would never happen, maybe. If that never happens, to be independent of that ever happening, and still having an influence over d5, this next move c3, as though the standard stuff knight c2 to e3 is really on the cards, without necessarily a bishop g5 move being played now, because there's no absolute pin. Maybe, possibly, black can get away with f6 in that position, but we'll have to check. It doesn't look as though the pin is as effective as usual, but there is an open invitation for the g5 square because of this h5 as well, making it difficult to get rid of any piece on g5 here. So a very interesting position with very interesting differences from a standard Sicilian Sveshnikov. This Kalashnikov territory, but with a twist with this h5, h4 plan imminent, and actually h4 is played now. So does Magnus want to routinely castle here himself, or can he improve his grip on d5, or maybe even can he even consider castling queenside? Maybe the thing is, if he plays bishop e3, yes, he could continue maybe with bishop e3. It looks like a plausible move, but he has to factor in black taking on d5 and maybe reaching some sort of comforting position. This next move, instead of going for castling queenside or castling kingside, knight c2 is entirely in line with classical play against the Sicilian Sveshnikov. Maybe get a knight to e3, or in some cases knight coming to b4 is dangerous as well if a knight is not covering b4. We see now actually this becoming an important fact, because now Nakamura commits the bishop takes d5, and this drives the knight away from that b4 square. So with knight a5 we have a knight on the rim, which is often dim, as they say. we have this potential for knight b4 just being as effective sometimes as knight e3. You can imagine a knight b4 route to get into the black position, for example c6, if this bishop was liberated like with f4, would be quite dangerous for black. And in fact, it's this bishop which now is kind of liberated by Magnus with f4, giving it actually the e4 square and giving it a better grip on c6, just in case knight b4 to c6 is going to be made more effective than this route, knight e3. It looks as though there's some perks to this route. It doesn't block in the bishop. It looks good, knight b4, in certain circumstances here. Nakamura has some development problems. He is skating on thin ice. When you skate on thin ice in chess, the punishment, as mentioned, is usually harsh forcing moves directed against the king, which have to be legally responded to, not like threats against pieces, but if the king's caught in the centre, also the rooks would have the side effect of not being connected, and the pieces generally will have a hard time developing. If things like king safety are not attended to, that's like a basic minimal requirement of most chess positions, and one of the important functions of the opening is often to provide king safety as well as connecting rooks. Now here with this next move, the ice skating continues. The question is, will it be punished? Okay, it has some function note to be rule breaking here, putting pressure on g3. And okay, how does Magnus react to this? Well, actually he uses a forcing move now, g4, and if say knight h6, then you can imagine h3 is very comfortable for white. With this pawn going nowhere, this bishop's starting to be hemmed in by its own pawns in this structure. f5 would be good with a continual threat on, say, the knight. e4 is nice to be celebrated. This knight can either go to b4 or to e3 later. So here we see, actually, in response to this forcing move, a forcing move from black, h3. Now this comes with some potential long-term downsides, that this h-pawn could actually be a tactical liability at some point in the future. Although in this position here, it doesn't look as though there's a big problem. It's defended by the rook. Okay, so at the moment, after bishop e4, you might not think that black is doing that badly here. We see two knights on the rim being dim, but okay, isn't this in some way dangerous? And also you can factor in counterplay opportunities for black, that say on the seemingly appealing f-file opening, f takes e5 might be some sort of temptation, but what you get is some counterplay with the bishop potentially using dark squares later. Not immediately because of b4s and stuff, but at some point this bishop could see the light of day. At the moment, this bishop, perhaps from Magnus's perspective, is an important one to keep docked here in the starting area on the f8 square. This can be picked on at some point in the future, perhaps. And actually what we see here is not, say, a routine f-file opening, but rather just castling kingside. And the rook is naturally placed to gain a little bit of space with, say, f5, which will have the advantage of keeping this bishop out of the game. But how would you imagine this pawn being a target? What would be the exploitable targets without open lines? Well, this I think is one of the important maybe lessons here so far, that if Magnus's play is to be believed, in this position he doesn't need to rely on line opening. He can rely on space and still exploit perhaps potential king safety issues. After g6 we see the move king h1, so no rush at all for f takes e5, and in fact black now has the luxury of moving that bishop finally to g7, and it looks at this point as though black is doing okay, an excitingly dynamic position, you might think. And of course f takes e5 seems actually out of the question, position giving the bishop the beautiful e5 square for black to enjoy. But no, doubt is cast over that bishop with f5. It might actually be now a tactical target to f6 in the near future. And black doesn't really want to play f6 here. Fg would seem crushing. Other moves don't seem that good. G5 seems pretty committal, and it might be that F6 in the future is going to be nasty. So that's something to check out maybe in the second pass, though. G5, even though it looks pretty grim, is it actually potentially playable? But in this position, actually, Nakamura played G takes F5. We see G takes F5. And again, you know, black is having a hard time with any potential castling opportunities in this position. Castling here would seem quite suicidal, shall we say, because of F6 and Queen H5. The rook actually has to guard the H5 square away from the queen. Another point to note, I think, that this line opening wouldn't have just favoured the bishop, but potentially this knight coming in to say D6 if D6 was available. These two pawns really don't like these two pieces in this structure, it seems. So, and Magnus is playing on that fact, I believe. So knight G2. And now actually knight G2 has unfortunately a certain weakness of the last move, which can be logically deduced here, that the knight was actually protecting the F3 square. And with this makes possible this next forcing move to be much more effective, this F6. Because now bishop takes F6, we can have queen F3, and it's pretty nasty that if that bishop moves back, we have queen takes F7 mating. So F6 puts the bishop back in its box, it seems, because also it seems bishop H6, white can react with queen H5, which is a pretty nasty pin on the H8 rook. So the bishop is going back in its box, and these two pawns are really basically in this position torturing these two pieces, if nothing else. Not only that, this pawn now is affording the bishop F5, which could pick on the H3 pawn. So it seems there are certain issues evolving, not just around black's king safety here, not just around these two pieces either, but also this slightly loose pawn now on H3, which this next move, queen F3, kind of betrays the idea that maybe actually bishop F5 and just taking on H3 could be a problem, let alone the black king in the center. We see now the move queen C7, and now lo and behold we see actually knight B4. On knight E3 maybe this knight could have taken it. Okay, so knight B4 is a road in for knight C6, which would actually stop black castling queenside even. Not that black would want to castle queenside necessarily, because of check and bishop takes H3 and this knight would be loose. Now we see knight B7, and now knight C6. So black is now stopped from actually castling. And yes, it is told to us that we should really try and castle and try and develop pieces and try and have a solid position, and only then try and play chess, because I think certain basic requirements of positions are met. If those basic requirements are often not met, then often it's forcing moves which mete out drastic punishment. So will this be the case in this position? Will drastic punishment be meted out here? Is black playing with fire? Is black skating on thin ice? We see the move knight c5 now, and this h3 pawn is put under question a little bit, as well as potentially other things actually. We see after bishop f5 that actually this bishop has got a good scope along the whole diagonal, but technically bishop h3 does seem like an appealing threat as well. And in fact, knight d7 is an indication that maybe that's the least of black's worries, to lose this h3 here to bishop takes h3, and there might be an important technical reason behind that, maybe, for example, well, it's actually difficult to suggest concrete moves for black at the moment, but it seems bishop takes h3 might actually be playable. It does activate the rook though. This next move instead does have alternative perks. Bishop g5. The black piece has already been kept out of the game. This can be implemented at the most appropriate, most effective time possible. It doesn't have to be implemented straight away. Bishop takes h3. Okay, and Nakamura's next move, rook g8. contains unfortunately another basic deducible weakness of the last move here, that the rook is no longer covering the h5 square. And actually in this position the h5 square for the queen is quite useful, and it does go there. Not only this bishop can not only just take here, it can also now threaten bishop e6 using the pin on the f7 pawn. So in all this, remarkably, it hasn't been the f-file opening up which is starting to expose the king as a slight liability in this position, but in fact this space gaining squashing f6 has opened up some diagonal opportunities to the black king, as well as keeping this bishop really locked in with its own pawn structure without any f takes e5 of being needed. Nakamura's next move, knight b6, is trying to expose the weakness of d5. Now this is answered tactically and exploiting the pin with bishop e6, protecting d5 against knight d5, and also starting to threaten now f7 directly. For example, knight e7 is looking pretty nasty, just to threaten queen f7, to interrupt the protection of the queen on the f7 pawn. So it looks as though black's position is going, or has been going, into more and more levels of criticality, and this needed to be precisely calculated, because it looks as though isn't this asking for an unpinning, a tactical unpinning to try and win material. Well, Nakamura does actually play a tactical move here. Rook takes g5. Unfortunately, black winning material here doesn't help solve king's safety issues. After queen takes g5, f takes e6. The unfortunate thing in this position as well, after d takes e6, is that this knight is actually shielding this from being check. This knight is actually a good defensive resource for the white king here. Now white is threatening f7 actually mating, because this knight is stopping the king from moving to d8. And this is a pretty serious position for black. And in fact, so serious that Nakamura felt compelled to resign here. It looks as though this mate threat of f7 is pretty nasty and unable to be parried. It's one of Magnus's most crushing games of the tournament, and I think puts him at about 2870 FIDE rating or thereabouts. If you go to 2700chess.com, I think they offer a real-time rating service. So congratulations to Magnus. It was showing what can happen if you don't castle. But I think, okay, it's a very, very harsh lesson, but in some games, you know, sometimes it is an advantage, sometimes to get that little bit of advantage, sometimes doing something active before castling. That rule breaking, that skating on thin ice, needs to be very carefully considered sometimes, because sometimes it is great to do things before routinely casting. But here, black never really got his pieces out of the box. The king's safety remains an increasingly large issue emerging, as well as other issues along the way, which are kind of used as also concerns, along with the main central concern of the king in the centre. Let's have a look with an engine view now. This final position, just for the record, what is actually going on here? The threat is, I assume, mate with f7. There's various threats of mate actually, mating in two with queen g6, queen h5. So this diagonal, can it actually be parried? Well, let's try, for example, knight f4. We also have f7 as a major threat, just to win the queen as well. So this is actually a completely all-over position. There's nothing non-controversial, nothing tricky about this. This isn't one of Magnus's opposite colour bishop and pawn endings where someone resigned but they might have had some play. This is totally a completely lost position. This is an absolutely major threat. If the bishop tries, for example, bishop e7, just for a laugh to have a look at, queen h5 check, king f8, queen h8, fine. We can have a look at other legal moves. I think it's fairly pointless. This f7 is just such a huge threat here. It's unfortunate that it's not only the knight keeping the king out of d8, it's the queen on f7. So queen takes c6, we see that demonstrated, that f7 is mate because the queen's actually stopping the king going to d8. So it's not just the knight. So unfortunately f7 is mega effective in this position. So let's go back and trace the origins of how this disaster occurred, how it could have possibly been avoided maybe. So standard Sveshnikov is knight f6 here, so I believe this is Kalashnikov. And in terms of reference checks, I'm wondering what the popularity of d6 to knight f6 is in this position. Let's do a quick reference check. It seems actually that d6 is quite popular in this position with 9,410 games. a6 is also popular. Knight f6 is 411 games. So the Sveshnikov is quite popular, maybe more recently. So d6, okay, let's go back, d6, and we see the move g3. Did this somehow bypass Nakamura's opening preparation? G3, we see the move on my database here, knight c3 to be very popular, 4,677 games, c4 3,400, about 3,400 games, a4 491, bishop e3 265, bishop c4 190, knight b5 to c3 coming about 101. G3 we see with 65 games. The main exponents include Ivanchuk, none, Hamdovich, Fedorich, I think. Okay, so Ivanchuk has apparently played g3 in this position before. That's one of the strongest players here. Now, I'll be surprised if the move h5 has been played a lot before. Apparently Nigel Short's been playing h5 before in 2003. That's interesting. The 27 games we have with bishop e7, 15 games with bishop e6, 7 games with knight f6, 6 games with a6. h5 is 5 games, so the more adventurous have played h5 here in this position. In the short game, actually, he lost to John Nunn in 1990 with h5. Now, I guess we could have a quick look at that game for a laugh. There's also a game, I think, of Demis Hassapis, who later became, by the way, a multi-millionaire with the theme park. He's got a game in 1990 when he was active in chess. Apparently he played this way against Federer. I think that must have been the Lloyd's Bet Masters. But the non-short game is of particular interest. Let's have a quick look at how that went. So Nigel Short playing black against John Nunn. Interesting. Very different feel to the game, where at least black seemed to not get the king slaughtered completely in the centre of the board, but Nunn still had an advantage here in this line. And in fact, what a strange position after bishop takes f3 to resign. I think he's just blundered with knight g6. I think that's the reason. Knight g6 just wins in this position. Whoops. Okay, so that was Nunn against Short in 1990. Hoogevens, Weekend Z actually, 1990. Netherlands. Fascinating. So this move, h5, has an interesting record. So my old friend Demis Hassapis as well has a game against John Federer at 2560 where h4 was played. Interesting that John Federer in the Lloyd's Bet Open of 1990. This is an interesting game in this line. It's such a rare line, it's just kind of fascinating to see how these alternative games would have gone. So this is very, very different. Anyway, White eventually won in 56 moves. So very, very creative idea, h5. And so there's some interesting responses like h4, h3, bishop g2 or knight c3. So in the game we saw knight 1 to c3, which has been played by John Nunn before against Short. So knight 1 to c3, and then we see a6, So the move a6, yes, following that other game. b5. So knight d5. Played in this position, knight d5. Alright, I think we're really out of opening book theory, so let's continue here. So it seems technically black, from an engine point of view, seems to be doing okay here. So why would this be? Why would the engine evaluation be about equal? Interesting. Did black really blunder terribly later? Bishop g4, f3, bishop goes back, c3, and all of a sudden, yeah, white's got a slight advantage now. We see h4. I think it's quite committal, this h4 plan. For a start, the g5 square might be useful at some point to white without being hassled with h6. So there's kind of indirectly less control over g5. The other thing is this rook's kind of committed to defending these squares, and it's not really going to be helping to castle kingside later with a pawn missing if black decides to castle kingside. So there's a king safety aspect of it as well. So knight c2, and we see now black giving up the light square bishop, and we know that that can be a tactical seed of complete destruction for black sometimes, to give up a bishop of a certain colour. Usually punishment will eventually logically flow forcing moves relating to that colour complex. So we're looking for light square disasters now as white, and it seems white's valuation did go up significantly. So did black have to relinquish the light square bishop here by playing bishop takes d5? What else? So after this knight c2, what was white actually threatening? a4 is a standard kind of threat against this Sveshnikov, to play a4. So maybe that was a concern, among other things. It seems actually that's the main thing that the engine's factoring in here. Because then you have things like rook a8 and knight c7 to follow. So the knight's a real pain here if it's just staying there. I hope you follow that as an example, why that's a threat. a4, a takes, rook takes, queen takes. You can imagine knight c7. So this knight staying there is a pain in black's side. So I guess, but the engine is recommending, say, knight a5 or rook c8 to work around the knight. And that's actually one of the reasons I gave up this Sveshnikov. I was actually fed up of huge knights on d5. It becomes a kind of nightmare, literally, to face. So, but white here with this light square bishop, which doesn't look as though it's that active at the moment, but we saw it being completely activated later, gaining in strength after f4, immediately gaining access to the e4 square. So if black wants to kick it, now it's got e4 rather than just the poxy f1 square, more glamorous for the e4 square. So we see now knight f5, which seems to be a good move in the circumstance. Let's give a what if. What if black tried to castle queenside? I think it would just get slaughtered. F takes e, and the bishop's already showing its power along the diagonal, for example like this, end of game. So it's pretty nasty already, this bishop. In fact, it's preventing black from doing things which maybe in a different game would have been possible. Now we see the move g4, okay, which might not be the most technically precise, but it did look impressive for just stopping black's pieces from doing anything really. Is the knight really going to be wanting to go to h6 here? We can check that out. If white castles here, let's see what can go wrong in this position. On queen d7, let's see, h3, black castling queenside. What would be wrong with this? Well, it seems actually a4 is with the bonus that the king is on the queen side here, so not only opening up the a file, but also mating the king could be a consequence here. So let's follow this through. Knight b4, this knight joining the bishop on the starting squares, a4 thematic move usually against the Sveshnikov. And here, okay, technically, how is black actually destroyed? Does it need evidence? Rook f2, queen e2, maybe just the a file generally is a disaster after rook f2, and even queen e2 just getting rid of the defender. So okay, so black maybe not that keen to try and castle queenside in some variations coming up. Plays actually the move h3, which might be the best move here, rather than knight h6. So we see bishop e4, which may be the best move. The check is very interesting here. Why wasn't it played? Patzer Caesar check, Patzer plays check is an expression sometimes used, I think cynically by Fischer. Sometimes it's not the best move to check. Is it not a good move here at all? King f1, let's see. Knight h6, let's go with knight e6 or knight e7. If we go knight e7, queen e2, what is white actually threatening here? F takes and maybe d6, for example, is a threat. If black tries e takes, would that be any good? And queen f6 looks a bit better than the game actually, but still, okay. It looks as though black's position has quite a few weaknesses. So even if the queens came off, d6 looks weak, the f file looks weak. So if black plays like this, f5 still looks really weak. The f file still looks really weak. But it does actually, to be honest, look a lot better than the game. So maybe this was actually a missed opportunity to throw in this check. It causes a little bit of disruption to white's easy play, perhaps, to throw in this check. So knight e7 here, if that's not immediately punishable with anything. You might ask, well, what was wrong with f takes here? That's a question. D takes, doesn't d6 work? We have rook d8 here, and black might actually start to get good pieces potentially. The way Magnus has played this is without needing complications. Well, queen h4 should have been played, but now after knight h4 we see this kind of squeezing strategy rather than opening strategy. Squeezing rather than opening, where squeezing can still have some of the properties of opening along the diagonals apparently, while keeping all the pieces in really bad positions and locked in by their own pawn structure. So that's a fascinating concept of this game. It seems that after g6 the actual squeezing strategy of f5 can be so effective with minimal risk. That f5 here. Now how could black actually react in the most appropriate way here? After g takes, what if we did play the ugly f6? Does that lose in some spectacular way? Maybe rook g1 is a good forcing move. Knight g2, knight b4. White has an advantage, but okay. And it looks as though there's a huge liability on the g file, unless black can help defend. Whoops. Help defend with rook a7 at some point on that g file. That looks to be some sort of problem on the g file. Let's go with rook h4, taking as an example. This is pretty nasty. The bishop is really a dead piece here. Pretty nasty to try and threaten something. It looks pretty miserable, this position in any case. So okay, so knight g2 was chosen, which does mean now f6 is more effective. It seems. Was it so clear cut after bishop takes f6, queen f3? Is there a resource here which was missed? Well, there is actually knight f4 after takes. Rook h4 is a resource, counter-attacking on e4. Queen f5. Black king is just a sitting target to rook a e1's here, surely. Rook a e1, bishop e5, knight d4. It starts to look a bit horrific still. Even though black's got that bishop on e5, this position isn't so hot, it would seem. Okay, this kind of position is pretty nasty as well. King still kind of exposed. If we follow this a little bit, Okay, it's things like rook d7 threatened. So that's pretty nasty, that kind of thing. So we see actually bishop f8. The bishop goes back in its box. The starting square, queen f3. What is the actual threat at the moment? Knight b4 remains a positional idea for knight c6 at some point. That's one of the main ones, but I thought also bishop f5 at some point for bishop h3. Let's see, queen c7 played. Now knight b4, kind of virtually pinning that knight. If it doesn't want to defend c6, this knight will go to c6, and that happens exactly now. Knight c5, and now we see this bishop f5, really powerful. King really stuck in the center now. There's no going back in black's position, no rewind, no undo button. The king is in the center, waiting, unfortunately, for white to build up potentially more and more pressure. This knight is doing a useful job, to be fair, of stopping rook a1, which might have been useful for white. After rook g8 we see a weakness of the last move, but what else? This rook actually can't seem to move here to many useful squares. If black did nothing, I think then just bishop takes h3 surely, and this knight then is forced to move, and then queen e4, the knight's hit again, and then actually we even have a queen sacrifice forcing move. Queen takes g6. So this kind of thing is just showing the unpleasantness, the punishment meted out when certain requirements are not met for king safety, that forcing move punishments just start to appear and appear and appear. So, and they appear here, the weakness of the last move for queen h5 just to tap into bishop e6 now for a major pin. On f7 protecting d5 as well, defending and attacking. And this tactic just doesn't work. It's a broken position. It seems, I don't know what black can do anyway in this position. The knight, which is shielding e1, if that moves, if that was moved, it's pretty horrendous. The e file can be used, for example, here with rook a e1 check. The forcing moves all are starting to take black apart, really. It's just everything's too loose tactically in black's position. So this was a pretty way of ending the game. So maybe good sport from Nakamura, creating an artistic final move position to be celebrated and held up as a way of punishing the opponent when they haven't castled, and try and play actively without castling first, which is one of the kind of general principles you hear about a lot, about not trying to play actively before castling. Okay, well done to Magnus, and well done for Nakamura for playing in such a sporting, attacking, dynamic manner and showing us all what can happen if in a riskless kind of counterplay removal way of not giving black too many opportunities to exploit the king in the center. Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.